Вась, открой, пожалуйста.
Раз, два, три. Раз, два, три. Раз, два, три. Раз, два. Один, два, три. Раз, два.
Один, два, один, два.
1, 2, 1, 2.
Це англійський був канал.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Англійської немає у нас програмочки, ні?
Немає, вони тільки десь надсилали.
Ну так, надсилали.
А так
Через програму брати з собою лаптоп, бо мені ще на іншу роботу бігти сьогодні.
Ні, я брала, але правда в мене тут немає, це просто для інших потреб. Я так з телефона підглядала їм регалії. Єдине, що в масках дуже важко.
Так, а ми коли працюємо, ми ж знімаємо.
Ну, це ми просто узгоджуємо з колегами, щоб раптом комусь
коли
некомфортно.
працюємо, то знімаємо. Так. І некомфортно, і все ж таки воно трошки...
Ну, так, я не знаю, в мене така вона, як це, тканинна, і трошечки все одно є ворсинки, а от такої, як у вас, то я взагалі починаю кашляти, бо коли говориш, то заковтуєш ці невеличкі ворсиночки, воно дуже некомфортно. Ну так, бо була в нас вчора. Що зник звук.
Раз, два, три. Раз, два, три. Один, два. У нас аудиторія може писати питання собі, і ви їх будете бачити по цих двох вікнах. Власне, ну і вибирати найбільш змістовні запитання, якщо вас будуть чекати запитання, якщо вони будуть цікаві, якщо вони будуть в принципі. Ось онлайн-спікерів у нас не буде, тому ви побачите на цих екранах панельну дискусію, як тільки запуститься трансляція. Це буде таке.
А де ми транслюємося? Я вчора намагалась безуспішно знайти лінк, щоб розмістити на свій.
Facebook і YouTube. Я вам не пишу.
Давайте, бо мої колеги може створити там почекати запитань. Женя, привіт.
Привіт. Ти просто пробіжала, ти вже не
Вибач, будь ласка, бо я ж спізнилась і
я
ти
точно так не забігав, знаєш, чи що.
Я просто перейшла. Все, є. 5 хвилин на виступ, 2 хвилини.
Спікери були абсолютно не те, що таке за один одним задавати один
Те, на що мені треба програму, щоб не поновити сервері, чи всі
Я вам
пам'ятали?
зараз у сайті також скину скріншоти програми.
Друкованого нічого немає.
Так, ось всі трансляції. Я вам написати, вибору в чому. Ви також там не пишеш. Іноді у нас буває.
Денис, прізвище? Все. Можемо співпрацювати.
Так, я тоді запрошую Сашу.
Дениси програму не надіслав.
Так, зараз. Олег?
Та тут супер, це не має значення.
Іде сідати.
Доброго дня, купа експертів з'ясовують, на яких рівнях Зачитайте ви. Добре. Вітаю, колеги. Вітаю
Morning, colleagues.
подруги, хто нас
Good
дивиться.
morning, our friends who are watching us. Today we are starting the dialogues about
Зараз
reforms,
будемо говорити
and
про молоду
we will be
політику
speaking
коаліції
about
для
youth
оборони
policy.
Франківська.
I'm
Я
Olena
сьогодні буду головою
Podobied-Frankivska,
нашої
and I
дискусії.
will be the moderator
Діалогу
today.
також є
And
присутні
today we
гості
have
з представників
speakers,
громадського суспільства,
representatives of
місцевої
the
влади.
civil society,
Є
of
невеличка
the
програма, є регламент
state powers,
підтримки
and we
виступів.
have a
Також
5 minutes agenda.
можете ті, хто
Also,
дивиться цю
those who
трансляцію,
are
ставити
watching
питання в
this
чат. Ми будемо їх
broadcasting,
зачитувати,
you
і
have the
ті, хто
possibility to
буде
ask the questions
можливість,
in
будемо
the
їх
chat.
задавати
We
спікерам.
will be
Тоді
asking
хвилину
those
на
questions
запитання,
to the
якщо будуть
speakers,
звучати
and the
на
speakers will
вступі.
have 2 minutes to
Наше
answer them.
сьогоднішнє завдання
So our today's
обговорити
task
документ,
is
який
to
був
discuss the brief,
підготовлений
which was
про молодіжну політику,
drafted
але
on
я
the youth
би просила
policy, but
сконцентруватися
I will be
на
asking
речах, які
to
вже
focus
відбулися,
not on
а
what have already
майбутньому.
happened,
Вас
but
чекає дуже багато
rather on
викликів.
the future, as
Це
we
і
are going to face
повідомлення
number
з
of challenges.
Bondarenko, це і виклики
These are the
пов'язані
COVID
з
pandemic situation
фінансовим
and
станом
also
нашої
the
держави. Отже,
financial
хотілося,
situation
щоб ми
in our
поговорили
country.
про це.
And I would
І
love us
я
to
буду
talk about this.
запрошувати
I
присутніх
will
до слова, напевно,
be inviting
колег, так як це
the
вже
colleagues as
прозвучало
it's
підготовлено.
written in the
Тому
agenda. That's
перше
why
слово Василю
I'm
Мокану,
passing
депутату
the
Ради
floor to
України,
Vasyl Mokan,
заступнику
the MP,
комітету з
who is the
питань
deputy
молодіжної
head of the
політики.
Parliament Committee on Youth and Sports. Good
Доброго
morning to
ранку
everyone.
за цей захід.
Thanks for the organizers
Те,
for
що
this
маємо
event,
можливість
and that we have the
обговорити ці
possibility to
важливі
discuss
для нашої держави
those
сфери
very
молодіжної
topical
політики. І хочу
issues
сказати, що
and
ми
the sphere of youth
законодавці,
policy. As the
можемо констатувати
legislators, we
багато
can
різних
state that
співпрацю
we have closer collaboration of the parliament and the NGOs in the parliament of the ninth convocation.
не тільки
And
інституції самих парламентарів,
it's not
також і представників
the
громадських організацій,
parliaments who should be praised for this, but
бізнесу,
rather the NGOs and the experts who find the
виходячи
communication ways.
з того, що
And I believe that together we will have the outcome in the future.
коротко сказати про
I will
існуючий
briefly
стан
tell you about the current situation
на засадах
on the draft
політики
law
ці
of the
36
general provisions of youth policy.
ми його
There is
готуємо
it's
до
36
пленарного
3718,
виходить на фінальну
and
стадію.
we are at the final stage,
Кілька речей закладається в
and
законодавстві
some
у сфері
elements
молодіжної
are
політики,
being
не оновлені
drafted in the
різних
youth policy, which has not been renewed for more than 20 years. And it's very important as we should be in line with the current trend and to take into consideration the modernization of the legislation. The world is changing and Ukraine is not an exception, and youth, as our background of the society, as our future, should have the chance to participate in the political and social events and should have this institutionalization and has to influence in the way. And the state should pay attention to this category of population.
По прогнозах до
The forecasts say
кінця року
that at the end of the year,
законопроект
that the draft law will be ready for the second reading.
багато достатньо правок
There are
до
a number of amendments which were submitted to the second reading, but the main
основи для
complex
участі в
is that
консолідації
we
молодіжної
are
сфери.
drafting
Дуже важливо
the way for this utilization, and we will be establishing a new agency that will be Ukrainia's youth center. We also submitted an amendment to the budget to have the possibility to allocate funds for Ukrainian youth fund. But first, we have to adopt the law. As for the perspectives, it can happen if not at the end of this session, but at the beginning of the next one. At least after the draft law will be ready for voting in general, I will be lobbying to put it in the agenda in the parliament. And I believe that we have the potential for this, and these legislative initiatives drafted together with all of us will give the incentive to develop the youth sphere. And we understand that the financing is not the only issue which we have. Yes, it's true that we had an issue that for a number of years the youth policy was financed as the least necessary sector. But another important issue is that not only how many funds are being allocated, but the efficiency of the usage of those funds. And in this area, we are also planning together with the Ministry of Youth and Sports to conduct a lot of work to use to have the usage of the allocated funds most effective, and also the oversight and also involvement of the youth and the civil society in those programs. And we should have this at a better stage. I will be ready to answer the question, so I was not going into detail. It was just a welcoming part of my speech. Thank you, Mr. Vasyl. We don't have questions right now, but maybe till the end of the broadcasting we will have them. And now I'm passing the floor to Maryna Popatenko, who is the Deputy Minister of Youth and Sports of Ukraine. Good morning, colleagues. I'm really pleased to join this expert discussion and to uh, discuss our reform-based approaches in the youth policy, and would like to underline that due to our fruitful collaboration with youth and with the assistance of youth, we have drafted the strategic document that will be the document on the basis of which we will be working, and the priorities set in those documents will be guiding us. We are speaking about the national strategy of the youth policy development till 2030. And now this document was adopted in the Cabinet of Ministers, and now it's in the Office of the President. So we hope that till the end of the year, this national strategy of the youth development will be signed by the President. And we have the concept of the social plus Ukrainian Youth 2025 was designed, and we also believe that until the end of the year this concept will be adopted. Then we will start designing national program which will be aiming at the specific tools of the development of youth. And here we're speaking about the young employee program, which is important, and it started functioning from 2014. It's aimed at increasing the qualifications and improvement of skills, those who are working in the youth policy. So we have to understand that without qualified approach of youth work, we will have no effective outcomes. That's why we are now trying to introduce the new profession as a youth worker, and it should be entered into the classificator of the professions in the profession grid, so that should also improve the quality of the youth work in Ukraine. And we are focusing on the development of the youth infrastructure. Ukraine has 183 youth centers, which have been very actively developed for the last 4 years. And in the new law, in the new draft law, which Vasyl mentioned, we are focusing on three level of development of the youth centers. So the Pan-Ukrainian Youth Center was established last year, and it should be focused on the developing the network of youth centers in the regions. So this development of the youth infrastructure and the program youth workers should be developed together. Um, in the development of the youth policy, based on the concept, we are paying to the civil society competence and to the education. That's the participation of youth. And here we are focusing on those platters as consultative councils And for the 2 years, there are provisions which regulate those provisions are on the work of youth councils, and we should be paying attention to the development of the capacities of youth councils and to assist in forming those platforms where the youth and the local governments could have the discussions that we will provide the participation of youth in the decision-taking process. We also have other aims where we are trying to facilitate the work of the local governments who should develop the competencies of youth work. And another point that we are trying to have this young youth capital, and where we should try to find the joint politics where the youth can feel the possibilities and can understand how they can develop at the regional level, and also join the social economic development of its city and region. And it's really important in the framework of decentralization, because as we are finishing this process, we should understand that young people should understand the tools and the possibilities of their own development. And for us, it's very important the development of civil society, an important tool of the delegation of powers through the national youth policy and implementation of local programs, and that's the competition of projects. So when inviting the civil society institutes, the state should pay attention, especially in the framework of youth policy, through the development of capacities of our partners. And is area in the next year to start the mechanism of the institutional assistance. It will start with the trainings, with the designing the necessary tools and increasing the competencies of the employees and workers of the civil society. Thank you to Maryna Popatenko. We do not have questions from the audience. I have some questions on my side, and now I'm inviting Yuriy Yuzych, who is the chairman of the board Plast National Scout Organization of Ukraine. As for the brief, there is the analysis of the situation in it, and there are some recommendations which are very important for our youth policy to be efficient. If we translate those recommendations into an ordinary young person in a community, they look the following way. So any young person should have a possibility to come to a certain place. Now the main place where the young people are joining are bars or cafes, because there are no places where say there are no places with the employees not such as just guards. So we should establish some youth centers where young people could come and communicate. So as Estonians have this situation that for 300 young people they have one youth center, and in our case for 10 million young people, around 300 young youth centers. It's not even the third of the newly established communities are covered. So first we have to develop the network of the youth centers where young people can feel safe and could have the possibility to develop their initiatives behind the education at their leisure time. And in these centers, they should not turn into those drinking bars. The employees should work there who understand how the centers should be organized and who understand who the young people are right now. Uh, and we should have the trainings for those employees who can talk the same language as the young people, and to communicate to them the possibilities of self development. So if in a few years we could come to the outcome that we have youth centers in all the communities, 200 more centers, and there will be employees working in those centers with the necessary competence. Then next step, the young people will have a question. uh, uh, so if there are the issues which cannot be solved, that's why we should also develop those youth councils, and they have been established in around 3 communities, but they should exist in every community. And then the youth policy shouldn't be interpreted as something separate. That's in fact the policy which is a cross-sectoral, which exists in the issues starting from agriculture and architecture and everywhere. And we have some issues or dealing with the young people in all sectors. So the young people will not feel the innovations as owned by themselves, so they will trying to escape to other countries, to Europe, where their opinion is taken into account. Those three aspects which I mentioned are included in the draft law which Vasyl mentioned. I will only add that for all this to happen, we need not only the legislation, because we already have the center, those employees, and the councils. But unfortunately, our policy is post-Soviet in a way, especially to young people. And that's why we should establish different tools to support the young initiatives, and this draft law should add those tools. But we have to design those tools even without the legislation, and not only in the youth policy. We have the draft law on local self-governance, and there is Article number 5, where there is special part dedicated to the involvement of young people and children in the work of local governments as advisors. That's why we have to simplify the procedures which exist, because we have situation when the uh, youth organizations, for example, as Plast, we have been communicating for 6 years that the institutional assistance is needed in Ukraine, and we've received this grant from the Swedish government, while the Ukrainian government is still in the process of adopting the draft law, and then the next step will be the bylaws. So we have to make the process less bureaucratic, and the young people should stay in the communities and should develop their communities. So we should make the life comfortable in the communities, and we should build Europe in Ukraine. Thank you, Yuriy Yuzych. And now I would like to pass the floor to Roman Tychkivskyy, who is the CEO of the Ukrainian Leadership Academy. Uh, Thank you, Yuri, for the information which was included in the brief. Now it's interesting to listen the opinion of Roman about the brief. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the organizing of this event. While reading the brief, I was reflecting on the situation where we are working. So the circumstances which we are facing as an organization, the Ukrainian Leadership Academy, and we are working with the teenagers aged from 14 to 19, and that's those who are graduating from schools, and also the freshmen of the university, and the pupils from high school. So we are represented in 7 regions of Ukraine. I will agree with the statements Yurko made. We are trying to make the process very bureaucratic at different levels. And very often we have the feeling that that we want to do something positive for our young people, which means to the society, but we have to prove 10 times that we have a very good ideas, and that's why the motivation is lost. No, it could be supported by the internal motivation, by understanding of what is going on in the country, and that young people is the future of the country. And if we are not going to work with them today, there will be no second day tomorrow.
Therefore, it's extremely important to listen to the young people, to know what they strive for. And we are optimistic with regard to the processes under decentralization. We believe that, first of all, we should have the resources and the will to cooperate and to reach out to the young people. We are the proponents of the approaches of using business principles in working with the young people. It is the business of the state to support the stakeholders working with the young people so that they provide the support that the young people really need. And at the same time, they should support the private initiative in this area, be it at the national or the local level. Seldom do we think about what the young people do, but we rather program certain things at the governmental level, and communications are not actually tailor-made for the young people. In the context of the pandemic, we see that the young people are at a loss. The formal and non-formal education systems were unprepared for such challenges. And I believe that our weakness, the weakness of youth organizations and those organizations that work with the young people, is the inability to adjust the ecosystem to the needs of the youth of the entire country. Because we have young people in Luhansk and in Ivano-Frankivsk, we usually focus on the needs of the young people in large cities, but we do not reach out to the rural areas, to the rural young people. And we usually work on a premise that we lack resources, but it's not about the lack of resources, but rather of the inefficient use of the available resources. And young people lack skills of financial management, and donors should contribute to the development of those skills. But what we observe in the donor community is the lack of coordination in their initiatives and projects. What we do lack, in fact, is the institutional support so that organizations become self-sustained and have the infrastructure required for their activities. And the government and the communities should do their best to facilitate the use of such infrastructures. Oftentimes, we have to persuade bureaucrats and public servers at all levels that we are worthy of this support. And we are left to our own devices while facing the challenges. And we have to work for several years paying huge rents. Only then can we rely on certain support. But I believe that with good initiative, the youth organization should be supported by the local governments in terms of certain premises for their operations, and be patient, because 1 year, 2 years is not enough to show good performance for these youth organizations. So I feel that stakeholders still lack trust in youth organizations because there are a lot of the so-called fake organizations with fancy titles, with fancy names and labels, but with no activity whatsoever. They sometimes win competitions, they get grants, but they do not work effectively. And not only am I speaking about the Leadership Academy, but we face a lot of such cases, and we should respond to this very effectively. And the government should install certain filters in order to make this process effective and efficient. Thank you, Roman. I will give the floor to Oleh Slabospytskiy. He is the member of the board of the National Ukrainian Youth Association. Thank you very much. I agree with many of the previous speakers, and I would like to analyze the policy brief. All of us have had a chance to see that the major issue that differentiates us from the Western countries is that not more than 3% of young people are engaged in the activities of the youth organizations. We know that there are a lot of various NGOs and projects targeting young people that seem to be implementing progress and programs aiming to support young people, but they do not change the situation with the young people. And we have to reach out to the 90+% of the young people who are not engaged in any way in either volunteering or else any other public activism. Speaking about the regional perspective rather than that of large cities. Many communities haven't got any organizations working with the young people whatsoever. And we are speaking about the new occupation of the youth worker. But if we do mean to establish infrastructure for the young people, we should be thinking about the quality of the youth policies. All of us want these 300 available youth centers to provide high quality services to the young people. And we are doing our best to offer assistance on the part of the civil society. And we need to encourage communities to have at least several youth workers working in their respective territories. As far as the institutional support is concerned, it is an acute problem. We've discussed it intensely, and we understand that budget funds, budget support is almost unavailable. Many NGOs are discouraged and frustrated, and they do not apply for such grants because they see that they have to overcome lots of bureaucratic hurdles in order to succeed in their applications. So this money should go to support the better management of such project if we really mean institutional support of the youth NGOs. There are a lot of projects, and we know of them, that are implemented annually in Ukraine. But nobody's assessing the quality and the performance of those projects. So this is what we should emphasize now, and we should be paying special heed to. Now, this bill on the fundamentals of youth policy is prepared to the second reading, and I think that we should contribute to make it high quality instrument of the public policy. Now I will give the floor to Yevhen Bondarenko, who is acting director of the All-Ukrainian Youth Center. Good morning, dear colleagues. On behalf of the All-Ukrainian Youth Center, I would like to comment on the policy brief, and if you don't know who we are the first governmental institution implementing youth policies in this country. We were established back in 2005, and in 2019, we were institutionalized. We are located in the center of the city. We've got very good premises, 100 square meters large, and we are now working to build capacity of this center and to improve the infrastructure of our outreach. We've got the board of directors at the youth center, and we are finalizing the regulation on the expert board at our center, and by the end of this year we are planning to have it adopted, and we hope that it will start operating next year. We believe that the expert board should exist not only attached to our organization. It would be a good idea to have them regionally and locally. And in the autumn, we hosted 4 regional fora for the youth organizations. And we know that many youth centers are unaware of those expert boards and of the opportunity to have such boards attached to them. Very few of them understand why they need expert boards and how it can contribute to the performance of the youth centers. In parallel to this resolution or regulation on the expert board at this All-Ukrainian Youth Center, we support the idea of expanding this practice countrywide. We are now establishing a 3-tier system of the national, regional, and local youth centers, and the Forum for Infrastructure Development exposed it that not all oblasts have regional youth centers as matters stand today. Now we are trying to develop the entire network, and we believe that local and central youth centers should cooperate very closely with the regional ones. And we encourage those oblasts where they have a proactive youth environment to do their best to set up such regional centers in cooperation with the representatives of the ministries at the regional level and with other stakeholders. In parallel, we are most interested in expanding this outreach so that not 3%, but many more young people get engaged in implementing youth policies, and so that the popularity of being engaged in youth movement is growing. As we see, a lot of young people are unaware of what's going on in large cities in Kiev when they reside in smaller towns or rural areas. This is a fact of life, and we have to move towards communicating the existing programs and projects to the local organizations. And we in the center are planning to do that in cooperation with the associations and civil society organizations that work nationally and locally. And we understand that there is certain good practice and experience to be rolled out and disseminated. Once I was appointed acting director of the center, I have learned that even under the pandemic conditions, with all the quarantine restrictions in place, we managed to carry out 60 events. On the one hand, they were the all-national events in cooperation with the Ministry of Youth and Sport. They were the events hosted by us. There were several international programs, but many of them were initiated by NGOs, both national and regional. Some NGOs contacted us. They are local organizations, but once they got the opportunity to get some platform where they can co-host an event, they were very glad. And it is a very good example of the fact that Kyiv, with its well-developed network of CSOs, sometimes faces issues when an NGO with a wonderful idea still lacks those platforms to host their events. And to end, I would like to say that it's extremely important for us that the story of the All-Ukrainian Youth Center is a success story. Thank you, Yevhen Bondarenko. I'll give the floor to Anna Ostrikova. She's a youth work expert of UNDP. Good morning, dear colleagues. Good morning, all of the participants. I would like to say that 2020 is indeed a flagman year for the youth policy in Ukraine. At the same time, we faced new challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic. It exposed certain issues in the youth environment and in the youth networks. It was a challenge to everyone who works with young people because we had to analyze the current needs of the young people, do the needs assessment, and translate or transfer our activities online, so that we could reach out to the young people under the lockdown conditions. I would like to share some of the life hacks that we've accumulated over this time. In June, July 2020, the social inform agencies with the UNDP support in Ukraine conducted a survey on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the young people in Ukraine. And the findings were fairly surprising. And I would were eye-openers. As the experience of implementing youth policy in Ukraine shows, in critical situation, in crisis situation in Ukraine, young people suffer the most, particularly over the next 2 or 3 years, of the following 2 or 3 years. The young people are most vulnerable. We see more cases of deviant behaviors, the use of a narcotic drug. Young people need psychological counseling, economic support, and new opportunities to be offered to them. We should have thought about that, say, 6 or 8 months ago, but I hope that now all the stakeholders will be better prepared to respond to these needs and to address these needs. If I may give you some stats, young people, student youth, suffered most economically because they usually work in the entertainment or HoReCa sector, but those institutions and businesses were locked down. And the young people who sought employment in the summer when the restrictions were lifted, every fourth found their jobs not or couldn't find their jobs, not because there were no vacancies, but because they lacked the required skills, which again highlights the challenges that the education system is facing. The crisis, as this crisis, as any crisis, combines challenges with new opportunities. Particularly, young people have come to understand the value of non-formal education that makes them more flexible, makes them capable of responding to the new challenges. And when we speak about how to reach out to the young people where they are and how we can be there, even though a lot of online learning platforms offered some free of charge courses during the complete lockdown. More than 40% of young people in Ukraine still believe that the major learning platform is YouTube. And we should remember about it when we think of the most effective communications channels. Besides, very few organizations manage to readjust their tools and approaches so as to offer certain online projects to the young people. Not because they didn't want to be more proactive and communicate with young people, but mostly because of the bureaucratic barriers. For example, communal youth centers cannot afford buying Zoom accounts and other programs that would help them to transform their activities. At the same time, the online youth work has been in place for several years now, but it hasn't made a lot of leeway in Ukraine. And we also identified lots of challenges and issues here. But now we understand that we should support both the young people themselves, but also those who work with them, who offer services to them, or arranging certain master classes, trainings, and offering certain tools to them for them then to engage young people in their local communities. In addition to certain institutional challenges, we are going to face the challenges of how to engage young people because the situation doesn't seem to improve. But if we join our effort with support of the international organizations, I'm sure that we will be able to provide those tools to people who are engaged in this sphere. Thank you. It was Anna Ostrikova, Youth Policy Officer from UNDP.
Friends, I'm inviting everyone to ask questions in the chat because we still have time to answer the questions. Maybe you will add something to our discussion, to some new perspective. And now I'm passing the floor to Vasyl Mokan. He wanted to comment. And then I have one question to everyone, and we will discuss it. I will react briefly on the comments from our speakers concerning the support of youth organizations. I believe that after the adoption of the law and the establishment of the Ukrainian Youth Fund, we will come to a new level, because when drafting the provisions on the Ukrainian Youth Fund and the program support and institutional assistance are included in this draft law. But also, we should measure the quality of those projects and simplify the procedure and decrease the level of bureaucracy. I believe that when we establish a separate agency, it will solve a number of issues and will simplify the procedure. And even now, we are making some steps in this area in the context of transparency and improvement of the process of selection of projects for state financing. And I agree that when we are speaking about the budget funds, the level of bureaucracy and oversight are very high. That's the historical approach, and we are going to break these stereotypes as well as the stereotypes that youth policy is not important. I will tell you even more. One of the criteria of the policy is the level of involvement of youth in the social and political processes, and it's critical low right now. Why we have this a hybrid situation in the world when the state is not going to deal with the Ukrainian youth? We should understand that other countries will be doing that. That's the element of our national security, because youth is the future of our country. One of the biggest issues which the social science is stating that young, educated, and talented youth are fleeing abroad. And we understand that one of the reasons is the lack of their own dwellings. That's one of the acute issues for young people. And in the draft law of the youth policy, we are leaving, or in fact, we are growing the number of the tools available from the state at the central level and at the level of the local governments to subsidize for loans of real estate. That's a huge issue, but I do believe that in the future we will have better outcomes and indicators of its utilization and this development of the youth infrastructure, as well as collaboration of the state and youth will become a better quality.
Що Марина Попатенко
I see that Maryna Popatenko, the Deputy Minister of Youth and Sport, is willing to join the discussion. I will comment to react on the brief. I'm happy that we are focused on the topic of the involvement of youth in the social life of the state. On my part, I can state that the Ministry of Youth and Sport has been developing a number of bylaws which will regulate a lot of aspects. And we are very interested to collaborate with the NGOs who are acting in the area of the youth development. We should establish the mechanisms, the tools which will decrease the bureaucratic burden and will regulate the work in the way that the institutes of civil society will feel and will understand the simplified procedures of collaboration with the state authorities. We will be focused on the content. So this will be non-formal education while increasing the level of competences of the young people. Thank you, Maryna. Friends, you have the possibility to ask questions in the chat until we have them there. I will comment as well from my experience, and I have been for 15 years in one of the youth organizations, and I'm the head of a youth organization. I understand that for those years, a number of decisions were advocated. This monitoring of the projects which are submitted to the competition. But I also understand that between the decision taking, I mean the adoption of the law and the implementation of those decisions, we have an important fact, and this factor is called resources. To take the decision, a big advocacy campaign is needed, but that's the point which could be achieved But as we are lacking resources in our country, how are we going to fight with the challenge that we have very few funds? And we are speaking that the ministry is planning to support the infrastructure and the youth employees, that in the new draft law the Ukrainian Youth Fund will be established, which should be aimed at solving the issues which we named to date. But I have a very specific question. What are the resources? Where are we going to take them from? So for this complicated our way ahead. Yurko is willing to answer. So we have a post-Soviet country, and everyone thinks that the projects should be funded by the president, and that without the participation of the president, nothing is happening. But in fact, in the developed countries of the world, main funds for the youth policy, that are 80% of funds are from local governments. That's why our task is that we should increase the tools for the local governments to finance the youth policy. The current law for so only the regional employment centers without any infrastructural work, and even this law, the new draft law, is giving the possibility to establish the youth councils and the youth centers and to have the employees. So the task of the ministry, not only the Ministry of Youth and Sports, because in the US, the main funder is not the Ministry of Youth and Sports, but the Ministry of Agriculture, which established 100 years ago, uh, created the network of the youth centers in the USA. So that's why the Ministry of Youth and Sports should design the programs which would highlight the necessary issues and assist the local governments in developing them. So in some issues, in some projects that the state should allocate more than 10 funds, but we should remember that the funds should go mostly from the local governments. And our Ministry of Finance is looking at the budgets in a very interesting way. So if they see the risks of expenditures, then the ministry is cutting this because they consider it as its own budget. But that's the budgets of the communities, and they should have the right to decide. And there are a list of good projects, and even when the local governments are willing to support the youth, the existing tools do not allow this. So the Decree 1049, which said that only funds for food could be allocated. So, for example, if there was a project to support the Ukrainian youth to go to the Australia and other countries to support Ukrainian youth, it's not possible because they believe that those allocations from the budget are not logical. I can't stop commenting. Yurko is saying very right things. That's the pain of the youth policy. And I am very happy that I have this practical experience of working with this decree 1049 and the tools to support the youth policy at the local level do exist. And what is important, we should change the approaches about the way of using the resources which are coming from the budget, both from the national and the local budget. So now with the Ministry of Finance, we have understanding. Until the end of the year, we will elaborate the changes to this decree. which regulates the expenditure of funds, and we understand those funds should have been used for new approaches, new tools, which appeared in the COVID pandemic situation, and we should also support the administrative work, because if we are speaking about the assistance to the Civil Society Institute, that's we should talk the amendments to this regulatory document, where the 20% for administrative needs, but it also showing that we should have a separate legislative framework for the support of institutional aspects. About the local governments, they should pay more attention to the youth policy, and now after those important processes which happened in Ukraine, I mean the elections of new deputies and local mayors, then together with the Association of the Territorial Units, communities, it's important for us to explain about the approaches and tools which already exist in Ukraine, and those novelties and innovative approaches from the new draft law, that when the new deputy commissions and budget commissions and youth commissions, to make it more clear for them about the use tools, especially in the local budgets. Thank you. Roman is willing to comment. Thank you. So when I was going here in a very inspired spirit, and I will live with a very inspired spirit at this important conference. The attention is paid to the youth policy, and it's a great plus. So I'm very thankful from myself, from our team, that you are paying attention to this topic as to the priority. And everyone present on the stage, we are on the same page, because we are willing for the youth to receive enough attention, enough resources, and enough opportunities to develop. And in the future, we will achieve everything, but we would love to happen to make it happen faster, because even what we had after the revolution of dignity, we understood who we are, and the critical mass of Ukrainian young people who were willing to serve for the Ukrainian society increased greatly, but also for those years a great number left Ukraine. But we do not have enough powers to explain to the state power how important the youth is. So not at the level of the government or a cabinet or minister of the local authorities. No, we are not capable to confirm, to convince them how important the youth is. In the virtual world, the young people see a very different life because everything is happening very fast. And that's why they're living to those places where the solutions are found fast. That's why we should find the mechanism to open the open market. So the initiatives should be supported both at the local and the national level. At the same time, I'm very happy that the youth centers infrastructure was created. That's the tool of the state to influence the local policy, local youth policies. But this infrastructure should be supported with good remuneration, with the HR resources. So the Ministry of Youth and Sports should have the resources for the support of those employees, and they should be working, not thinking how they're going to survive with their families. And we should think that we have a great potential in the country, and sometimes I feel that the black market is really have a great amount. And we should join our efforts with the international organizations to convince the national stakeholders and the local businesses that we should invest in our young people. Thank you, Roman. And to wrap up, I will tell you that we are all have high aspirations about the new draft law. That's why my question will to Mr. Vasyl. What should we do in a consolidated way to make this Ukrainian youth fund to start function and to be adopted not at the level of law, but to have real funds and to have the possibility to support the initiatives which were mentioned today. So with the pan-Ukrainian youth centers and a network of local youth centers and training programs and institutional assistance. Do you have any ideas? So the first step was taken, that the draft law was designed, which, if adopted, will have no other ways for the country but to finance. But I'd like to say that there is another important step which could be done with the consolidated efforts, and here the civil society is playing a huge role. That the advocacy and the explanation that what the colleague mentioned about not only in society but to mass media.
All the stakeholders, including private businesses and policymakers, all of them should be on the same side. When it comes to financial resources, to the money, everyone understands that there are certain priorities. For 2021, those would be the national security in the situation of the armed aggression on the part of the neighboring country, and reintegration of the temporarily occupied territories. Under the conditions of the pandemic, it's about public health and medical education, but we should concert our effort in order to actually make youth policy part of those priorities. Legislation, both primary and secondary, is just only one step towards this end. We should use all potential platforms and channels in order to communicate this idea. The bill and then the law will also have to play the role in it. Because as far as I know, many people, including young people, know nothing about this bill. And if we are speaking about this modern piece of legislation, we have to be proactive in conveying the main ideas, main provisions of this legislation to the stakeholders. Thank you very much. We still have several minutes to go, and those who are watching us online, you still have an opportunity to ask a question. And then in view of what you said, that if Ukrainian government fails to focus on the young people, some other country or other government will take advantage of that. We should remember that neighboring countries have several programs to engage young people from Ukraine to go there and stay there. So given these challenges and given the internal challenges, including in the sphere of public health and national security and defense, the question is, who will be the target audience of our outreach? The young people are looking for simpler ways to have their needs met. And the simpler way usually is associated with residing abroad. do we in Ukraine have any ideas as to what needs to be done right now or should have been done yesterday in order to address or to meet the challenges of today, including brain drain amongst young people? Here I'm speaking also about the demographic situation with the reduced birth rate. We've got 11 million young people according to our governmental statistics, but I believe that those are even fewer. So what are the immediate steps to be taken to improve the situation? I'm skeptical, unfortunately, and I think that we won't be able to slow down the mass emigration of young people because of the lack of infrastructure, because of the low salaries, and brain drain will continue, and the outflow of the young population will continue. We can find ourselves in these situations akin to that of Ireland, with 50 million Irish people living abroad. So that is an unavoidable process, but it is a global process, and it does not always depend on us, even if we do our best to prevent it. Just President Zelensky, during the inauguration speech, said that about 6 million young people, young Ukrainians live abroad, and it is essential to be bringing them back. And it is important for the government, for the ministry, to remember that those young people are huge resource. I know an IT specialist who lives and works in Silicon Valley, and I can't imagine what can attract him back to Ukraine. But from there, he can be supporting Ukraine. So we should be able to communicate proactive young people who reside abroad and who can contribute to these hubs of innovative ideas. So some countries have ministries of diaspora who target young people living abroad to engage them in developing their own national economies. For this to be a fact, we need to invest into this, both money and effort. I agree that we need to engage in advocacy to work with this segment of the young people who are not engaged with the use of all potential communication channels and media. We, as an organization, spend too much of our resources for rent. We've been in place for 6 years, but we haven't found a site where we can actually stay and use the resources available to us, not to pay the rent, but to do our programmatic activities. So under the circumstances, we cannot obtain the property that we can use for our programmatic activities. And we have to actually try to overcome certain bureaucratic barriers to persuade those in power that these issues have to be addressed. Without the physical space where we can get located and operate from, we won't be able to work effectively. Look at the Ukrainian Catholic University. They created the hub, which is one of the tourist attractions in Lviv today. In Kharkiv, for example, we invested up to 10 million as an NGO into the wonderful building, but we cannot continue living there or residing there because we can't afford such a rent. So the city is afraid that if they continue to support us with rental payments, they will be punished for that. At the same time, I understand that communication is extremely important, but amalgamated territorial communities, municipalities should simplify the procedures of allocating spaces to organizations like this, because we have never let the government, including local governments, down in what concerns our accountability. So I encourage international donors to support us in communicating our messages and raising public awareness of that. I understand that the bill on the fundamentals of youth policy contains certain sections or provisions that allow youth NGOs to pay smaller rents. We are also an NGOs, and we are also advocating for this to be translated into reality. Thank you. I would like to say that reiterating that we conducted a survey in this summer, and we had focus groups with younger people of 25 through 30 who had to return to Ukraine under the lockdown. And they said that having stayed in Ukraine for a couple of months, they've come to understand that there is no need for them to leave their homes and go elsewhere, because there are employment opportunities, there are business development opportunities here in Ukraine, which testifies to the fact that young Ukrainians know very little about their country, about their heritage, about their culture, about its business opportunities. Over the last time, I've traveled a lot to smaller towns and communities, and I know that oftentimes young people stay in their local communities, and if they travel to a large city, it is to get a visa for employment abroad. So we should address it, and we should concert our effort and perhaps work more online, use those channels to tell young people what we are, what we can do here in Ukraine, and what opportunities are open to them here, just to keep them at home, to educate them about education and employment opportunities in their home country. And it doesn't need too much funding for us to convey this message online or in any other format. Maryna, I cannot but agree that advocacy for youth policies at all levels is important. And this is impossible without a joining effort with the civil society and civil society organizations. And I'm sure that we cannot be successful until we focus our attention and our effort at the grassroots level, at working with people in the local communities via various communication channels, all at our respective levels, explaining what approaches are possible, what tools are available, and how the government is prepared to cooperate with CSOs at the local level. And we are prepared to encourage young people to engage with their local communities. Innovative approaches can actually facilitate the development of local communities, and our new initiatives, our new approaches can do that. Thank you, Maryna. I would like to thank all of the colleagues for sharing their ideas, their approaches, their best practices. We can see that certain very effective tools are in place, and one of those is the new bill on fundamentals of the youth policies, and we hope that we will be better prepared to meet the needs of today. That is, supporting training programs, awareness raising programs, providing institutional support to youth NGOs for them to build their capacities to engage young people. We've got a lot of issues, we've got a lot of challenges, but we should work together to find solutions. And we hope to continue this dialogue, and the people who are interested in improving youth policies would realize that it is a cross-sectoral issue, and it opens up opportunities for both the government, the civil society, and the private sector. So, young people should be not only the concern of the Ministry of Youth and Sports, but also of the MPs and other ministries and public agencies. Thank you very much for your participation, and I would like to thank all the participants for their interest. Thank you.
Вітаю усіх. Мене звати Софія Середа, я журналістка радіо.
Good afternoon to everyone. I am Sofia Sereda, and I am journalist of Radio Svoboda, and I have the honor to moderate the National Memory Policy panel. And together with the speakers which are present here today, we will be talking what the parliament and the government managed succeeded to do in the context of the national memory policy and what should be done further. But before we start our discussion, I would like to tell you more about the speakers and to ask their opinions briefly, just by one sentence, what it means for them, the notion of national memory policy and why it is important for them. So today we have Ivan Patradak, that's the Dean of the History Faculty of Kiev Taras Shevchenko National University. Mr. Ivan, good afternoon. It would be great to listen what is national memory policy for you. Yes. You see, it's complicated to put it in one sentence, but that a complex of state tools to create this certain perception of the citizens of Ukraine about their history. Why it is important for you? Because that through this, the course for the future is calibrated. Anton Drobovych, the chairman of the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory. That's the policy of national policy is about the restoration of national memory because the empire and the total empire Soviet Union and in the United States were trying to distort, to falsify the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire to our memory, and that's why it's important for us to restore how it is, in fact, to know the complicated truth about ourselves. It's not always a good one. Sometimes it's a tragic and a dramatic. Sometimes it's heroic one, but sometimes also those for which we feel some shame. So if we are not going to talk about it, then we won't have a safe and sound identity. And we have my colleague Yuzych, the next speaker, who is the MP, member of the Parliament Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy. So what is it for you? For me, the national memory policy is the basis and the grounding for the existence of the national state. Because why do we need the state if there is no nation without its mayor? That's why, for me, that's the basis of the existence of the state. And another speaker, that's Yaryna Yasynevych, the program coordinator of the Center for Liberation Movement Studies, the member of the board of the Reanimation package of reform. Yuriy, what is it for you? Good afternoon. For me, that's about two things. That's about the experience and immunity. The first, the immunity or for violation of human rights. It's sort of a vaccination which assists us to react to the efforts of the government to intrude in the negative sense into the rights of people. And the exister, that's about what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses. Thank you for all the answers. And now I suggest that we should move to the discussion and to speak about the national memory, or what are the reforms which are happening right now in line with the Toronto principles. And I would like to specify to those who are watching us what it is. So the Toronto principles are the key priorities in conducting the reforms in Ukraine, which should happen from 2019 to 2023. They have been drafted for half a year, and from December 2018 for June 2019, the representatives of the civil society together with the RPR, and according to the Toronto principles, the implementation of the national memory policy should be one of the priorities in 2019 and 2023. That's why I suggest dedicating our first part of discussion, what our government and the parliament succeeded to achieve in this reform. So we're allocating 10 minutes for every of the speaker, and then we will move to the second part of our discussion, and our viewers can write their questions in our chat, and we will then ask them. So we will start with Mr. Ivan. To your mind, what are the positive achievements of the Parliament of Ukraine in this year in the sector of national memory policy? If you would allow, I will speak in the context more than 1 year, because during this year, due to the pandemic situation and what we are living through with the whole world, it's complicated here. But if to speak in a broader context and a longer time period, the Ukraine, with its forming of the national memory, as I said, as a comprehensive package of measures, events to restore the truthful history and to have not the distorted perception by the citizens. So we had this dehumanization laws when we passed through the way which the post-communist countries were moving forward for 10 years. We did it in 2 years, and then opening of the archives, and the archives of the totalitarian special services are open unprecedentedly. And as I know, this level of openness does not exist in any country of the region. And we came to the complicated but necessary for the discussion those issues with our neighboring countries, with which we have common historical issues, with whom we have common historical discussions, and we have been debating on those topics, and thus it will bring us closer to understanding those pressing points, to commemorating the position of each other. So if we speak about this year, so at the end of the 2019, beginning 2020, we succeeded in one very important aspect, the National Memory Institute, and I believe that the head will tell more, that we succeeded in a very important aspect. That's a large-scale episode was introduced into our history as our dissident movement. It was in the it used to be in the shadow, and we brought it to a close. They used to be at the level of the revolution of the Second World War, and we brought this topic into the modern discussion. Another step which I believe was successful and important, the historical memory of the society now includes those fragments of local memories of ethnical and other groups who are citizens of Ukraine, and they have been inhabiting Ukraine for a long time. At the legislative level, have you noticed any achievements at the legislative level? I cannot tell you right now because I'm not following all the changes. Maybe the head of the institute knows more about the legal acts. Maybe something very important was approved, but there were something like law on decommunization. I'm very thankful. Now we would like to listen to Anton Drobovych.
Наскільки за останній рік просунулася Україна в законодавчому
How we moved forward in the legislative, from the legislative perspective. Thank you, Mr. Professor, for the words you said about some our efforts in some areas of work. I believe that the national memory policy was not the focus topic this year, and it's true that the COVID situation was the focus one. That's why I cannot name any reforming or legal acts which could be linked with the reform. There are some amendments. Now there is a draft law about the de-Sovietization of the legislation. It's a huge draft law which would amend the legal framework of Ukraine in a way, but it's not the direct topic of the national memory, but as the documentation is linked with our institute, and we are the central executive body which is functioning in this area. And the institute, together with the Museum of the Dignity Revolution, have designed the plan on the commemoration of the victims of the Revolution of Dignity. And that's about the continuity of the policy. We have changed the wordings, and I believe that there will be the decree on the commemorative dates. But these are the specific events which are linked with the stability rather than with the reform. Some initiatives suggested by the institute were included in the actions of the cabinet of ministers, but as the budget was cut, those measures look rather like some initiative, but not the practical steps, because it's not possible to implement them without the funds, as the National Archive, for example. The most important achievement for this year, I would consider the preservance of institutional capacity, of the continuity, sustainability, I would call, at least at some optimal level. So the governments were changing, and the heads of the ministries changed. The institute continued its work. It didn't stop, so all the processes were going on, and we were conducting the events, and we were drafting the draft laws, and we are very thankful to the Ministry of Culture, who also were involved for the strategic plans for the next year. For example, for the 2023, that's the mid-term planning. That's why the issue of national memory is included in their plans, but de facto there were some changes which could be considered as reforms. I would rather say that we are preparing this, and I believe that this would be not only the strategic documents which are supported by the funds. Otherwise, it's not enough to have the document. So I would like to specify that at the beginning you said that one of the reasons why those reforms are not implemented, these are the pandemic situation. But if we speak about the September 2019 till March 2020, why these reforms were not paid much attention by the cabinet of ministers and the government? If you're speaking about such very short time, then that's the life cycle is too short, and at the same time period, the government was changed, though nothing could be implemented. As I remember, Minister Bondarenko started the sectoral strategic planning for this, and it was not finished. and then the budget was cut. So all the attention was paid to what should be cut and what should be left. So even there was some priority of the national memory policy was the only one. So you could see the what is the national memory, where it is in the list. Even in the RPR, it's not on the first place. To my mind, it is on the last place in the cabinet of ministers. And about the stability in the state, it should be in top 3. And it's not because I'm at the position of the head and I should advocate this topic. But if we are willing to know who we are and where we are going, we should answer to those questions. That's why all those turbo mode aspects just weakened the will of the cabinet of ministers to deal with those aspects. Everyone was dealing with the energy, with the financial markets, and with healthcare.
Запитання, яке б я хотіла зробити до вас,
And
це
the second
наскільки
remark,
зараз у владі готові дослухатися
that
і дослухатися
the
до
representatives of
Національної
power
ради, ви сказали, що
are they ready to listen to the initiatives of statute? So even if they do not have the funds, how our ideas are perceived at a high level? Now the understanding of the agenda is higher, and these are the strategic answers. They are not visible at once. There are some tactical issues. Something is on fire, and for example, the issue of the education of science and of the national memory belong to the strategic area. So you cannot see the outcomes in 1 year, but you could see these outcomes in 10 years. But the attention of the Office of the President and the Cabinet of Ministers and other agencies and the Parliament are paying attention to this, because, for example, the national tensions exist about some events, and the president believes that consolidation should be one of the priorities, and we cannot speak about the consolidation without answering the questions about the erosion of dignity and what is our further way forward. How do we perceive the World War II, and how do we consider the the crimes? And in the parliament, we see the discussion about the national trident, and that the national symbols are being highly discussed. So most of the experts say that the trident is not the most, is not the highest priority. And now I'm willing to speak with Mykola Knishitsky, who is representative of the Parliament Committee of the Information Policy. So do you agree with Mr. Anton? Then now in the Verkhovna Rada, there is interest to the national memory. Some MPs do have, others doesn't have, but the policy of the state is defined by the ruling power, and the national memory is part of the national memory is the question of the power, because we should decide what nation's memory are we preserving. Is it post-Soviet Creoles, or that's the memory of the Ukrainian nation? So these are two completely different narratives. So the approaches have changed. And the policy of national memory started to be formed when Viktor Yushchenko was the president. That's the only period when it was formed. In other periods, this was not the antagonistic periods, but the priorities were different, and a different vision of the state. And the national memory was playing less role than to other politicians. And now we can see very similar situation after Maidan, when there was the majority and there was the start of the Russian-Ukraine aggression. That was the time when everyone united against this aggression. This policy appeared to be very important, and after Maidan, uh, there were a number of MPs in the parliament was not the common party value, but their individual.
I cannot say that there was very well thought policy of developing national memory, but there were people who were like-minded, who had joined energy and who were ready to implement it. Speaking about this parliament is totally different. Now the majority is different. Now we can say that the Ukrainian national memory is by and large ideology of two forces in parliament. That's European solidarity and Holos, and several individual MPs from other political parties. But if we look at the ruling party, that is the servant of the people, you will see lots of Ukrainian patriots to whom it is a value. But there are some others like Mr. Buzhansky and Shevchenko who've got the opposite values. So that's not the ideology that brings together this political force. Just the European solidarity sees as the overcoming sees the overcoming of the post-Soviet heritage as their priority. In Poland, for example, when Mr. Kaczynski was elected president, he supported this policy to bring people together, to unite the Poles. Today in Ukraine, the national memory policy is not a value in this country. At the same time, it isn't hostile to the powers that be. So our task today is to preserve the achievements made in the previous periods. Of course, we would like to have a more in-depth research in this area, setting up the memorial for the Babin Yar, creating the Revolution of Dignity museum, etc. But we should treasure the status quo. We should agree that under the circumstances, the situation is not bad. Being representative of the Verkhovna Rada Committee for Humanitarian and Information Policy, you will know that last year, this parliament was inaugurated. Can you tell me how many bills in this area were considered or adopted or have been considered and adopted since then? You know, that's a tough one. We did adopt the decommunization legislation in the previous parliament and commemorating the contribution of foreign Ukrainians. And as Mr. Drobovych said, the commemoration of those national landmarks is very important, and that's good. And new items appeared. We will be celebrating 150th anniversary of Lesa Ukrainka, and it is part of the national memory. The resolution was adopted to celebrate 185 years of Vasyl Stefanik's. So this is also national memory policy. National memory is a broad notion, and it is always politicized. If we look at Poland again and our relations with that country, despite various difficulties there, we have a lot of common pages in our history. And the Ukrainian situation does indeed entail lots of serious discussions about the periods pre-war and post-war. And there are a lot of values that bring Ukrainians together, and they continue to develop. So our task is to ensure sustainability, to ensure continuity, and to develop this memory. to what extent do you think MPs of this parliament are prepared to cooperate with the civil society and the structures engaged in implementing the national memory policy? This cooperation has always been in place, but when we speak about parliament, it is about different political forces and individual MPs. So I wish we could have clearer priorities, a deeper understanding of what national memory is about, and more heed being played to it. Thank you, and I will give the floor to Yaryna Yasynevych. As you will remember, that's the coordinator of program coordinator of the Center for Liberation Movement Research. Yaryna, being engaged in projects related to the preservation of the national remembrance and national memory policy, what do you think about the progress achieved to date in this area? Our organization analyzed the stance of the government vis-a-vis national memory policy, and I can tell you that the current governmental program ignores the issues of national memory. In the program, they only have two items. First of all, the deblocking and unfreezing the construction of the Heavenly 100 Heroes Museum and Babyn Yar, second part of that project. The Prime Minister submitted action program to Parliament, but it was never approved. And it only mentions the preservation of the national memory of the Ukrainian people, and it adds the establishment of the memorial to the fallen heroes. And as far as I understand, the government also plans to develop and launch the cultural barometer, the research of identity of Ukrainians. It has certain relation to the national memory policy. We can also say that the discussion was launched within round tables, etc. And now I understand that their activities have been muted a bit because of the pandemic, but I can say that despite all of those plans and promises, we've got a critical situation around the Revolution of Dignity Museum. And here I mean the searches in the museum and lack of coordination between the branches of government. So the Prosecutor General's office prohibited any works in the territories, but the Minister of Interior and the Security Service is now prosecuting the museum for not continuing the construction. So the situation is not resolved. It is still in the dead end, and nobody seems to know how to proceed from here. And we are concerned about this situation. We need this memorial, and we want institutions to coordinate their activities, and we want to people in charge of implementing the national memory policy to work comfortably. The government also ignores such issues as access to the archives of the Soviet secret services. And the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory suffered most in terms of lost funding from the government. And the newly established National Memory Archive was deprived of funding altogether. And now the draft state budget for 2021 that was approved by the Cabinet of Ministers yesterday provides for even bigger cuts in the funding of the Institute of National Memory. which testifies to the inadequate attention paid by the government and the ruling party to the entire concept of national memory. I can reiterate that this year the activities have been slowed down because of the pandemic. At the same time, I can tell you that the public attention to the activities of the Institute are at a high. We saw lots of public discussion and debate about the Babin Yar project implementation, and we know that the private initiative is being implemented in that territory, but the general public has a lot of questions about the origins of the funds used to implement that private initiative. On the other hand, there is the governmental, the state supported concept of the development in this area, and we still don't know which of the two projects will be implemented. And as we can see, the state initiated project does not enjoy support on the part of the president or powers that be. Unfortunately, positive expectations about the deblocking of the situation around the national memory conflicts with the Polish authorities have not been materialized. Last year, we were promised that this situation will be addressed, and the public actually discussed that broadly, particularly prior to Mr. Duda's Polish president's visit to Ukraine. But it, as I said, never found any practical implementation. The destroyed graves were not restored, the names were not restored either, and even though a lot of time has elapsed since then, we can't see any progress whatsoever. The parliamentary and governmental programs do not work to facilitate rehabilitation of the victims of repressions, and whereas Crimean Tatars who were deported in 1944 were not deemed as victims of political repressions. Thus, no issues relating to the compensations and certain benefits to them were not addressed. I understand that the costs would be cut even further, and the major funding would be channeled to control the COVID pandemic. But nonetheless, it was the first time since the Maidan revolution the government did not hold any consultations with the public to learn about the positions about the program of restoration or compensations to the victims of political repressions. Did you come up with any legislative proposals or initiatives? If yes, so what was the response on the government's part? So far, we haven't proposed any legislation, but we wanted to establish better context to develop the governmental program in the area of the national memory policy. But our initiatives were not responded to. Thank you very much. We've discussed the positive and negative aspects of the latest developments in the area of national memory policy. Now, almost each of you spoke about the lack of attention to the policy of national memory on the part of the government, particularly under the conditions of the pandemic. And does the government needs to rechannel the funds? But in your opinion, Which of the spheres of the national memory policy requires particular attention and immediate response? Mr. Pachulek, what's your response? I've listened to my colleagues and I understood that I haven't missed anything of the important developments in this area. So we see that Yaryna, the member of parliament, and Mr. Drobovych actually did not mention any of the important developments over the last year. So speaking about which of the segments of the national memory or national memory policy should be our top priority, I would mention some of them rather than one. You know, history and the national memory as part of history is seen as a passport of sorts that legitimizes any nation. Without history, there is no nation. So the national memory policy should focus first and foremost on consolidating the Ukrainian society around the national interests. And the first accent, the first focus of this stage should be on reviving, restoring the public understanding of our national statehood in the previous periods. The Ukrainian society, unfortunately, is still under the illusions that the Ukrainian state emerged back in 1991 from scratch. We were not tabula rasa at that time. And in the context of the centenary of the Ukrainian Revolution, I've mentioned several times at various events and on various occasions that we could have had our own state for 100 years now. Have we ever discussed these issues, not only in the context of our historic or economic or political development, if we had managed or our predecessors had managed to preserve the state, to make it happen. Hence, the values of our modern state. We cannot lose those values. The knowledge of our previous attempts to form, to establish the nation state here demonstrate the value of the true nation state. They are the background, they are the foundation and the passport of this state that legitimizes its right to existence. It's a certificate of birth, if you wish. So that's one segment of this policy. Another one, which is equally important and which corroborates the idea mentioned by my colleagues before, is finding the answer to the question, what have we suffered as a result of this failure to implement the idea of Ukrainian statehood, either in the 17th or in the early 20th century? We suffered a whole series of disasters that affected Ukrainian population of this territory, but not only them. People of various, actually, ethnic groups that used to live and still live in this territory. The entire history of the 20th century with its bloody impacts would have been different had the Ukrainian state been in place between the two world wars. We wouldn't have known about Holodomor, and Holocaust perhaps would have looked differently. Of course, these are all my fantasies, but the value and the importance and the role of the Ukrainian statehood is colossal, not only for the Ukrainian people, but to all people living in Ukraine and for the geopolitical situation in Ukraine and in the world at large. So focusing on these two segments, we will be better aware of the role of this policy of national memory.
And what do you think Ukraine should do to preserve those moments which you mentioned in your speech and to further transfer to the next generations? Of course, it's easy to tell me because I'm not a civil servant, so it's my personal, private opinion. To my mind, what have been done to the commemoration of Ukrainian statehood in the 100th anniversary of the state in 2017, only 10% have been done. It was a unique chance to transform those events 100 years ago into a fundament for building a modern Ukraine, because the events of 17th, 18th years of Bogdan Khmelnytsky and Cossack state are very away from now, and the modern attempt of Ukraine stem was 100 years ago. And unfortunately, we didn't use this chance at full because there were a number of conferences, some movies, then the changes of the uniform of the armed force, opening of the some memorial signs and tombs. But to my mind, these were only 10% of what should have been done in this unique period. So do I understand it right that there should have been also the legislative regulation for several years? It should have become the flagman of all the mass media and all the tools of informing the society. But in our case, it was just one of the number of topics. We should have been shouting about this. Every school children should have received some photos, some leaflets, some items which would install into their head that we are the next generation, the ancestors of this state, which had to exist from 1916 and which was destroyed by our neighbors, and it which appeared again in 1901 and which we will not allow to destroy again. Now I will ask Mr. Anton, the head of the National Memory Institute, what of the segments of the national memory policy should be in the focus of the power. Thank you. Some small comments. First, to reflect some aspects about the statement of Mr. Patrulak. In 2016, there was a decree of the President of Ukraine on commemoration of the 100th anniversary. It was a very interesting legal act because the 5-year plan was introduced, and the National Memory Institute for those years and 1 year have conducted huge events dedicated to this situation. But there was the legislation and was the tool, and dozens of events were taken. And in fact, it's a huge institutional step for the state, and we will have to reflect this act and this 5 years of commemoration, and both from the legal point of view and from the functioning of the legal text, and also of the executive branch of power. So next year we will still be commemorating and generalizing the practice. It's a very interesting story, an extraordinary one. I fully agree that not enough. So there was the initiative and there were the efforts of the National Memory Institute. All other institutions of the state power were not interested. Some had shot the movies, but not enough. I fully agree. That's why we have to think about the tools, how to involve others, because it's about the fundament for the new generations, about the Museum of the Dignity Revolution. It's a very alerting situation, but Yaryna said that the collaboration of the government branch and the prosecution office cannot be in line with other branches, because the legal and the law enforcement office cannot be dependent on the government. Unfortunately, we do not have this in line. You mean that they should be in line with the networks, that arrest of the Institutska Street were under the ruling of the Prosecutor General Lutsenko. And we still have this heritage. It was not solved in Lutsenko times, and the newcomers haven't solved it. It's a very complicated issue, and the ministry became the scapegoat. I believe that it's a shame, in fact. That's why solving this issue and the transparent situation should be the priority, in fact. Because creation of the National Memory Archive and the Museum of the Dignity Revolution is a huge work, and it should be top priorities in the visible part of what the state is doing. That the institutions of which are preserving the state integrity of the state. And in the archive, there are 4 million of cases. So, for example, we have a book of communism, which speaks about 20 million of victims of the Soviet Union. So that's the fact which was proved in the world. And those facts should be based on such institutions and national archives. And that would be the mecca for the Soviet researchers from all the world. That's why those institution is not just an archive; it's a huge political signal, and that's why we need the political will and the budget. And even the World Coalition should be established to fund this archive. What are the sectors where we should pay attention to? we should strengthen the institutional capacity of the agencies which are dealing of the restoration of the national memory. And I mean not only the institute, maybe even strengthening the legislation which gives the powers. What additional powers would you love to have additionally? It's not about the powers, but rather about the more specific status. It would be great if the parliament can adopt the legislation about the backgrounds of the national memory or the law which stipulates of the places of memory. Then it would be the place of memory such as Babin Yar or Drobovych Yar. Those two legal initiatives could be very fruitful. So if we had the possibility, it could be an achievement. Then the Ministry of Culture, Institute of National Memory should have strengthened capacity. And in the priorities, they should have more space in the strategic documents. The work of the work with the tombs and the commission about the commemorating of those who fought for the independence of Ukraine, people who perished in the World War II, they have several collisions. And when you are asking about the powers of the institute, what we are doing now, we are now we're assisting the Commission on Rehabilitation, and there was the State Interagency Commission on commemoration of those who perished. And I don't say that we should have these powers as the Polish Institute has, which has the power to investigate and to illustrate, but at least in those which I named, we do need some additional powers. And we also should inform the society about the role of the National Memory Institute. I'm very thankful, and I'd like to hear the position, the stance of Mykola Knyazhitsky and his vision, what aspects should be in the focus and what legal initiatives you are ready to suggest. And the point is not in the legislative initiatives, but rather in the policy of the government, which should be integral and sustainable. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian government, which did move completely away from what was created before, but it didn't suggest anything new. I would say that they rather moved the national memory policy from the center to the edge. There was a number of government projects. So everything what was happening, the National Dignity Museum and all those events such as the searches in the office of the director of this museum. And we understand that we live in the country where there is a pressure on the law enforcement offices. That's why there were researchers from the side of the General Prosecutor's Office. So no one would have been bringing to the National General Prosecutor's Office those who were participating in the Revolution of Dignity. So the prosecutor's office is not someone's business. That's why I believe that what is happening right now is very shameful, and the state power should understand the importance of this policy. That's the only way to hope, nothing else. But I believe that in the nearest future it won't be happening, because now those people are in power who are willing to protect the national memory or it is willing not to counteract with any memories which exist on the territory of Ukraine. That's why we are not going to wait for any integral policy. But what we had with the searches and other attempts are numerous. So we can say that the General Prosecutor's office, when Lutsenko was the General Prosecutor, they stopped the construction and they had their own evidences and arguments that the case is still going on, and that's why they would need this territory to conduct the investigation, to conduct the investigation activities, but at that time no one was bringing the head of this museum to the general prosecutor office, and it's happening right now when he is being searched at home. That's the element of the pressure on the national memory. That's also the way how the current power is acting. So what of the aspects of the national policy is important right now? And the approval of the Grand Coat of Arms should be approved right now. The Grand Coat of Arms is not a part of national memory. There were a number of people who didn't like the trident. That's why they were willing to invent a big coat or arms with some Soviet element. And we know that when Grushevsky asked the design of the coat of arms of the trident and the huge Ukraine. That's why we believe that that Ukraine and the modern Ukraine are different, and it could be reflected in the coat of arms. It's indicated that the coat of arms exists. So that's, I believe, the outdated elements. So it's not linked to the national memory. The government should state that Ukraine has a sustainable policy, that Ukraine was defending itself from the enemies, that those enemies should be named and victims should be named, and we should have the lessons learned, and the totalitarian regimes should be shamed, those who were in 20th years, and we should also commemorate all the victims which perished on the territory, both Ukrainians and Jews, during the Holocaust, and Romas. As Timothy Steiner was called, the blood territory is the territory where most of people perished, and that's why I believe that we should commemorate not only Ukrainians but all of them, and the state should oversight that no one intrudes in this policy, and this policy should be that stable to become the basis, and there will be no anti-Ukrainian reaction, but this government is not ready right now. And now I'm willing to ask Mrs. Yaryna about her vision, what aspects of the national memory should be most important.
The policy presupposes institutional development, and we believe that institutional processes should be completed with the establishment of the National Memory Archives, which means that the funds, sufficient funds, should be allocated. And the approach is not just to cut the funding of humanitarian policy and rechannel these funds into the national memory policies. Just we need to work consistently to change the attitude to the historical past of this country. The government actually adopted the law on commemorating and glorifying the fighters for independence, which was a statement. And the attitude to the Ukrainian insurgents army has changed thanks to that. When the KGB archives were first opened, and they saw that the archives did not hide any materials on the Ukrainian insurgency army's crimes, but rather on the KGB crimes. And now we can see how the prosecutor's office takes certain decisions that jeopardize the memory of the Revolution of Dignity, and why the security service comes to people at night to carry out searches, because KGB had such practices, and they are still guided by those KGB practices. The part of the decommunization is about stripping the security services, the special services of the powers in the areas where that do not pertain to their purview. So you will remember that they came to the former MP, Tatiana Chernovil, at 5 in the morning. So these institutional steps would be to create the Heavenly 100 Museum, the Holodomor Museum, and open up archives that will allow all of us today and our followers tomorrow to understand how the Soviet Union actually distorted the consciousness of the people, particularly those in the security services, for them to be either part of the state machinery or to perceive the entire world as the hostile one. And we developed our recommendations. You can see them in the policy brief. But my general conclusion is that when we opened up some documents related to the Holodomor, we understood that it was part of the information war or warfare waged against us by the Russian Federation. And we used to think that Ukrainians were prepared to suffer from the Holodomor. But when in 2014 the archives were opened, we saw that there was resistance to the Holodomor on the part of the even Ukrainian peasants. And now we see us ourselves differently. And the politicians did not actually did not hush up these facts from our history, just they were not aware themselves about it. And while conducting research in this area, we should go very carefully and cautiously. Unfortunately, there are some politicians in the ruling party who do not know the history, but they actually dare to set targets and certain aims that actually can worsen our approaches and the quality of our research. So, as I said, we should move very carefully, proceed very carefully. Just thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is almost up. To end, I would like to thank all of the speakers for sharing their vision of the national memory policies as they perceive it. And should we meet next year, I hope we will be able to discuss better progress and more achievements in this area. And I hope that even though pandemic has actually took too much of our attention, we will still remember about it. And Anton wanted to add something. Yes, I believe that the integration of efforts of the specified institutions that work in the area of national memory should consider their effort with the institutions that are putting up resistance to the Russian aggression now, because the topic of historic myths is exploited by the Russian propaganda, and we have to think of how to debunk those narratives, propagandistic narratives, and perhaps we should develop some framework documents that will help us in this area. Thank you very much. A very reasonable comment, and I hope that it will be taken on board in the future. I would like to remind you that tomorrow we are commemorating the victims of Holodomor in Ukraine. So I encourage all of the Ukrainians, all of those who are watching this stream to join in the initiative and light a candle, so that we will not live through such painful and tragic pages in our history anymore. Thank you very much.